All right.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming back to this continuation of the Kinder Institute Colloquium series on Friday afternoon, sponsored by our friends at Logboat Brewery. We invite you to stay for our Pursuit of Happiness hour after the talk and look forward to continuing the discussion there. We have a few people joining us online, and if you are, we are monitoring the questions online, so feel free to submit questions for the Q&A, and if you're with us in person, then be thinking of some questions for Q&A. I'm delighted to introduce Tara Ginnane to you, one of our incoming postdoctoral fellows at the Kinder Institute. She studied law at the University of Oxford and the University of Chicago before going to the great University of Texas at Austin to get her PhD in public law and political theory. And she is a political theorist, a constitutional theorist, and a scholar of comparative constitutionalism. And so she fits right into the Kinder Institute, and this is really her wheelhouse, thinking about especially the transatlantic and transnational dimensions of constitutional democracy. And so today she's sharing with us a bit from her dissertation research project and now book project. And the title is The Political Inclusion of Americans Abroad, History and Implications. Please join me in welcoming Tara.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today, and thank you to Justin for that very generous introduction. I'm very grateful to each of you for being here on a Friday afternoon to listen to my talk. And, this is my first semester here, and so I don't think that I've had the chance to meet everybody, and so I really look forward to meeting those of you that I haven't met yet very, very soon. So today I'm going to talk to you about Americans who live abroad and about the practice of external voting. And specifically, what I'm going to try to do is to identify the ideas about membership and belonging that I think were relevant to American external voting policy when it first passed in the 1970s. And you might know of external voting more colloquially as expat voting or as overseas voting. But however you know it, whatever you call it, it allows non-resident citizens or people who live outside their country of citizenship to vote in that country's national elections. So to take the example that we're going to be talking at length about this afternoon, non-resident American citizens, Americans who live abroad, can vote in federal elections pretty much, well, not pretty much, for the rest of their lives, no matter how long they've lived abroad. And by giving them that right, I think that what external voting does is that it really marks non-resident citizens as members of the American political community. And so I'm really interested in external voting because I think it's this very valuable opportunity to see and to examine American identity from a perspective that we don't normally consider and that can be quite unfamiliar to adopt. And as many of you will know well, because I'm sure some of you do it yourselves, historians and social scientists are really, really used to examining American identity from the perspective of immigration, right? What do people who tell us and the country's attitudes and policies towards them tell us about who and what America is? But even though we don't really do it very often, we can also think about American identity in terms of emigration, people who leave. And so by looking with you at this story about American external voting today, what I'm really hoping to do is to start exploring some of the edges of American political and national identity. And so do our understandings of that identity hold fast or instead break down as we consider people who leave American territory but stay part of the American political community? And what non-resident citizens do is they kind of stretch American identity across time and space. And so I want to know, and I hope to make you want to know too, does anything interesting happen to that identity as it stretches? So after this introduction, which is what we're happening right now, this talk has 5 parts. So after this, I'm going to discuss external voting and the related phenomenon of diaspora engagement. And then I'm going to discuss the historical development of external voting. And here what I want to suggest to you is that external voting for ordinary people who don't have any government affiliations, right? They're not part of the military, they don't work for an NGO or something, they don't work for the government. That really rode the coattails of military absentee voting. And then I'm going to discuss the legislative history of the major bill that enshrines external voting in American law. And here I really want to focus on what kind of ideas of membership were relevant to the passage of that law. And here's where I'm going to suggest to you one of my key arguments, which is going to be that the link that I tell you about in section 3 between the military and external voting is not just a coincidence, right? Instead, the military serves as a kind of template of virtuous citizenship as service that non-resident citizens kind of had to meet in order to be seen as meriting external voting rights, or as meriting really extraterritorial political membership. And then fifth, and finally, I'm going to reflect a little bit, and this part is very brief, about what this story of American external voting can tell us about American identity. But first of all, like I said at the outset, and like Justin said, I'm a new arrival at Kinder, and I'm thinking of this talk really as a way for me to introduce myself to all of you by telling you about a topic that I think is really cool. And so in that spirit of introductions, what I want to do is just take a minute to explain to you about my interest in external voting and where it comes from, both in terms of my biography and my research agenda, because I do think it'll give you some context for this project. So the first thing is that I, like some of you I know in the audience, have been a non-resident American citizen. And I was born in New York and I moved to Ireland, where my mother is from, when I was like 9 or 10. And so I grew up in Northern Ireland and I moved back to the US after college, which is like a whole story for another day. And so I think that external voting is really cool to study because it's a way for us to learn about ambiguous and complicated political identities, which social science models and theories, I think, often try to flatten to make tractable. But instead, I'm really interested in those kind of ambiguities and complications of political identity, because that's been a big feature of my life, right? I grew up in a different place than I was born, and the place where I grew up, right, Northern Ireland has very famous issues with identity. So my political identity is ambiguous, and I started to become interested in external voting because it lets you try to unravel and study and theorize, how political identities get ambiguous, and what does that mean for our understanding of politics. But external voting is also a big part of my research agenda. Like Justin said, I'm a democratic and constitutional theorist, and I have quite strong empirical interests. And so this project that I'm going to present to you is part of my more empirical work. And so I'm really interested, among other things, in how ideas about belonging and identity, essentially who's treated as a member where, get translated into law. And so the bigger dissertation project that this is like a bit of a chapter from tries to understand how ideas about membership influence external voting laws. And as well as that project, I'm also working on some other things about democratic boundaries and about understanding elections as social membership practices rather than just kind of technical devices. But anyway, so that's introductions. And now we can get back to business. So we're going to be establishing together today how Americans abroad got external voting rights and whether that means anything for how we understand American identity. And the first thing that I really want you to understand is that even though I'm telling you this story from an American perspective, external voting is not a uniquely American phenomenon, right? It's exactly the opposite. It's a very common practice across the whole world. The most recent survey that I'm aware of was done in 2007, and that found that around 80% of countries had some form of external voting. But I suspect that that's only gone up since then, because that's already quite a while ago. And countries tend to adopt external voting in waves. So countries like the United States, as well as the UK and Canada, and I think maybe Australia and a couple others, were very early adopters, which means that they all had the policy by around 1975. And a couple other countries followed in the 1980s, but the bulk of states really adopted it in the 1990s. And external voting policies can come in different forms. So to take just one example, some countries allow it in some elections, but not in others, right? So it might be allowed for presidential elections, but not legislative elections. And external voting is not an aberration. It's not something weird and crazy. At this stage, it's really just part of the standard toolkit of modern states. And it's also not an isolated development. Exactly the contrary. It is part of a much broader change in how state officials and governments spatialize national political community. So over the past several decades, states have increasingly sought to institutionalize political relations with people who move abroad by extending the policies, the effective power, and sometimes even the repressive apparatus of the state to include non-resident citizens abroad. And once upon a time, if you emigrated, right, if you left state territory, that was normally it. With a couple exceptions, the state that you left just wasn't really interested in you anymore. But now again, with some exceptions, states devote an awful lot of time and energy to trying to keep people who leave close through policies like external voting. And that's reflective of a very broad shift, that could be a subject of a talk in itself, in how states are tending to understand immigrants or diasporas. Where once they might have been a problem or an embarrassment, now they're a really valued resource. And so just to be clear, and because I know we have a lot of historians in the audience, I'm not saying that institutionalized relations between states and immigrants or people who leave are entirely new, right? Just like everything, they've happened to some extent in some places at some times. But what I am trying to say is that it's the institutionalization and the depth of these relations that's new. There are more examples of states trying to maintain political relations with people who leave in more different ways, and that's just more and more accepted as an entirely legitimate aspect of governance. And compared to other social science disciplines, political science and theory, my disciplines, really haven't done that much with external voting or with the broader phenomenon of diaspora policies. And I think that that's maybe because political scientists and even theorists tend to be hard-headed, right? They or we tend to think in terms of votes and power. And external voting doesn't always make a very big difference to the outcome of elections, and it often doesn't have such a big effect on who holds power in different places. But I think that reading that to downplay its significance is a big mistake. And that's because the increasing prevalence of policies like external voting is a signal. It's telling us that something about political identity and membership is changing. So the United States, to turn to our main country of interest today, it has a very expansive external voting policy. Under current law, non-resident American citizens can vote in all federal elections, no matter how long they've lived abroad. And that's pretty much as expansive as an external voting policy can get. And most states will actually also allow never resident citizens, so people who are American citizens who were born abroad and have never even lived in the US, to vote in US elections as well. And the fact that the United States external voting policy is so extensive is actually kind of surprising, given established theories of external voting. And none of those theories explains the United States case very well. In fact, they suggest that maybe it shouldn't really have this policy. So let's just take a couple of examples. So there's an idea, it's very popular and it's intuitive, that states extend external voting rights in order to attract remittances or investments from non-resident citizens. And that makes the most sense for poorer countries that are in a position of economic dependence on non-resident citizens, which isn't really the US, right? Alternatively, you might think that external voting is squarely political, right? State officials give non-resident citizens rights so that non-resident citizens can use them to vote for the officials. And in the US, you hear this kind of stuff normally around election time. There'll be articles wondering how all the Republicans in Israel will vote. But you shouldn't make too much of that, because I haven't really seen any evidence that American politicians are actually seriously competing for non-resident citizens' votes. And so finally, and this is the one that's the most interesting to me, and that we're going to focus on for the rest of this talk, so I'm sorry if you were more interested in the other ones. But some theorists link external voting to the understanding of nationhood that's dominant in the country. And so the idea here, I should say this comes up in political and social theory, as well as more political and social science, and more causal explanatory work. And the idea here is that ethnic conceptions of nationhood that define membership in terms of common descent or language or religion, things like that, should support external voting, because those things don't take any heed of state territorial borders, right? And the contrary idea is that civic or territorial conceptions that define nationhood in terms of shared values or joint subjection to laws should be incompatible with external voting, because you'd think that if you leave the territory, you're going to be leaving that civic or territorial community. And I don't mean at all to downplay the obvious ethnic and racialized elements of American identity over the years, and we'll come back to that at the end of this talk. But we normally think of the US as having a very strong civic or territorial identity. In fact, it's often considered to be one of the paragons, one of the leaders of such an identity. And so this raises a couple of questions, right? First of all, is it true that external voting is incompatible with civic or territorial membership? And that's a question that I'm going to come back to at the very end. But more pressingly, given that it doesn't make sense on any of these theories, what's going on with the US? Where did this policy come from? So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to try to answer these questions by reconstructing some of the ideas about membership that I think support external voting in the US. But before we get there, what I want to do is review the timeline of external voting, its historical development. And the reason why I want to do this is because from looking at the timeline, we can establish quite a strong relationship between external voting for citizens with no government affiliations and absentee voting for the military. So the first time that absentee voting for anyone in US elections becomes an issue is during the Civil War. And at least that's the first time that anyone has ever, that everyone always mentions. So if you do know of an earlier example, I'd like to hear it. But for the 1864 election, the Republican Party, led by Lincoln, of course, sought absentee voting rights for the military in time for that election. And ultimately, 19 states ended up allowing it. And so this picture depicts soldiers lining up to vote for the 1864 election. And then in the early 20th century, states began to allow absentee voting for citizens with no government affiliations who happened to be out of state on election day. And in 1916, Virginia is the first state to allow absentee voting for citizens abroad. And so by this point, when we get to 1916, we can see that the links between residency in a particular constituency and participation in elections are starting to work loose. But that is happening much more quickly for citizens who are in the country but out of state than it is for citizens who are abroad. And so those of you who know the history of the franchise in America know that franchise expansions are often linked to war for a variety of reasons. And that's the case in 1942, when in the midst of the Second World War, Congress passes the Soldier Voting Act that allows wartime military deployed abroad to vote in federal elections using a special ballot. And that's what this picture shows, right? One soldier swearing in another before he goes to cast his ballot. And in 1955, following up on recommendations that were made by the American Political Science Association, I believe at the request of President Truman, Congress passes the Federal Voting Assistance Act, and this act allows government employees who are posted abroad to vote from abroad. And so by this point in 1955, federal law is giving the right to vote from abroad to members of the military and to government employees who are posted abroad. But there's still just no federal right to vote from abroad for non-resident citizens who don't have any government affiliations. You know, and you mightn't be surprised to hear that some of those non-resident citizens who didn't have any government affiliations were rather unhappy to be left out. Some states let them vote, sure, but others didn't, and it all just depended on which state they were from. And you know, even from states that allowed it, people were often worried that if they did actually exercise the vote, they were going to expose themselves to additional taxation. So they wanted the right to vote and also a guarantee that that wasn't going to give them any additional tax obligations. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, non-resident citizens who were sort of fed up with the situation began to organize and lobby for things like citizenship transmission to their children who were born abroad, and also external voting. And you know, as this picture suggests, a lot of those people who were involved in that activism were women. And in 1968, these early campaigns started to bear fruit. Congress amended the FBAA to recommend that states allow citizens who are temporarily living abroad to vote. But you know, that's only a recommendation, it's not a requirement, and you know, just because Congress recommends something doesn't mean anything's going to happen. And it didn't do anything for the many permanent or long-term non-resident citizens. And so this picture on this slide that I mentioned briefly before shows some leaders of a group called the Association of Americans Resident Overseas, and they were posting off postcards to members of Congress. And what they called it the Tea Party campaign, and so they took a tea bag and they stapled it to a little postcard and they sent it to the Congress people with something about the Boston Tea Party and how they weren't represented either now. And people say that that actually had a big effect. So in 1976, we see things like the Tea Party, or the tea bag campaign, I should say, really bearing fruit. In 1976 is when Congress passes the Overseas Citizen Voting Rights Act, or the OCVRA. There's a lot of acronyms. And the OCVRA guarantees the right to vote in federal elections to citizens abroad, regardless of their government affiliations and regardless of the amount of time that they've been abroad for. And you know, while we have things that kind of look a little bit like external voting before the OCVRA, I think that it's the OCVRA that really establishes the principle of external voting in American law. Because before it, some people could vote from abroad in some circumstances, but you had to have government affiliations. You could only be abroad temporarily. But the OCVRA is really the first time that we see the United States government officially recognizing that citizens who live abroad are part of the political community. And the OCVRA gets replaced in 1986 by what's called the Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. And I don't really talk about that much more after this because all it does is streamline and consolidate the OCVRA. It doesn't actually, just kidding, it doesn't actually touch the principle of external voting. So now the situation is that non-resident American citizens can vote in United States elections just pretty much across the board. And this picture on this slide advertises the Democrats Abroad primary that was held in Oxford, which Kinder's own Jay Sexton was involved in. Oh yes, it is a photo credit. And you know, it's funny because if you pay attention, there are a lot of these primaries and caucuses that are held all over the world. And maybe we'll talk about it in the Q&A, but the Democrats organize abroad and the Republicans don't. So there is no, so don't ask Jay why didn't he hold the Republicans abroad primary. Okay, so I want to emphasize two things from this timeline. And the first and most important is, as I've already mentioned, the role of the military. And at this stage, all we can say is that the military is really the path breaker for voting from abroad, right? The military gets the right first, And then the other non-resident citizens can kind of ride its coattails with the path cleared. You know, the principle is accepted, the resistance is a little less strong. The second thing that I want to emphasize is that, you know, states began allowing people to vote from out of state, but still inside the country, earlier and easier than they did from abroad. And that's pretty reasonable, and it's pretty much about what you'd expect. But I flag it here because I think anyway that it's actually an interesting way to capture, you know, maybe the most fundamental movement in American political development. You know, and external voting in America implicates a lot of questions of federalism, and this is the only one I'm going to talk about here, but there are so many more. So external voting is this fundamentally relational concept, right? You've got to be outside of something. And ordinarily, that's the country. But it is conceivable, I think, that if the states were more significant as a locus of political identity in this country, like they used to be, you know, we might understand out-of-state voting as much more similar to out-of-country voting than we do. And the fact that we're not really that concerned with people living in one state and voting in another, like, I mean, I do, I don't know, maybe some of the rest of you do too. I think that maybe I shouldn't say that. I think that shows how the states have really diminished as distinctive political communities. So I want to shift now to a distinctive perspective, to a different perspective on external voting. So what I want to do is look at the legislative debates surrounding the OCVRA to try to find out what ideas about membership were relevant. And so recall that the OCVRA is the first law to guarantee external voting in federal elections. So really, it's the one that you want to look at, or it's one that I want to look at, if you want to see what lawmakers thought about the principle of external voting, including how they understood non-resident citizens' memberships. And this is where I'm going to try to make to you my claim that the military wasn't just a pathbreaker, it also provided a kind of template of virtuous citizenship as service warranting voting rights that non-resident citizens kind of get discursively constructed as fulfilling. But first of all, the OCVRA was a surprisingly bipartisan bill, and it passed really easily. And I just want to talk about that for a minute because I think it's surprising, and sometimes when I've told people about it in the past, they find it surprising too. And if you think about it from the perspective of today's politics, absentee voting is like massively controversial, right? And we all saw in the last election how many arguments there were about expanding mail-in voting. And this measure, it allowed potentially millions of citizens, no one really knew how many, they still don't, to vote from abroad, absentee. And it just didn't really provoke that much disagreement, although there was some. And it's also surprising because normally external voting is just really, really partisan. The party that thinks that it's going to benefit from it supports it, and all the other parties oppose it, right? Often, in other countries anyway, votes on external voting just fit perfectly along party lines. But I just don't see a whole lot of partisanship in the debate surrounding the OCVRA. And I'm not totally sure why that is. It could be I'm just looking in the wrong place. But I found some evidence from newspaper reporting at the time that suggests that each party thought that it had a potential constituency abroad. So Democrats, maybe predictably, thought that they had the students and the artists locked down, and the Republicans were pretty sure that they had the businessmen in the bag. So I think if you both think you're going to benefit, you just don't really, you know, it's better just not to bring it up and hope the other guy doesn't notice how many students and artists there are abroad. You know, and I should say here as well that, as is normally the case with franchise politics in the US, race is relevant too. And there is some reporting about unnamed Southern legislators at the time. Probably if you knew more about Congress then, you would know who they were. But there were some Southern legislators who were opposed to the bill because they worried that it would make it easier to register at home, right? And of course, we know why they wouldn't have wanted it to be easy to register at home. And so during the OCVRA debates, lawmakers made 4 different kinds of arguments about external voting. And it's really the last one that's about membership, so we're just going to fly through the others. So the first is constitutionality. Technically, what the OCVRA did is it required states to give voting rights in federal elections to people who didn't meet the state residency requirements. And so there was this huge debate about whether or not Congress had constitutional authority to override state residency requirements. And then the second kind of issue that came up a lot was about democracy, as you'd expect. Essentially, were non-resident citizens appropriate subjects of representation in the American federal government? What that came down to is whether they had interests at stake or other kinds of connections to elections. If I have ever to talk to you, there are some really interesting questions about federalism there, like what's the scale of the government that non-resident citizens need to be connected to. And the third kind of argument that's made in debates is about citizenship. Should non-resident citizens have to fulfill certain obligations of citizenship in order to vote in elections, and did they already fulfill them? So for some of you who might have lived abroad, it's not going to be at all surprising that non-resident citizens' tax liability was like the big issue here. And so I should take a break from these four kinds of argument now to just tell you something about the literature. So not that many people have studied American external voting in any great detail. By now you might be thinking, well, yeah. But one of the few people who has is a political scientist who's named Amanda Klikowski von Koppenfels, who's at the University of Kent's Brussels location. And she understands American external voting as entirely about constitutionality, equal rights, and equal citizenship, right? And so if she were giving you this talk, this would be the end of the OCVRA section, right? We've covered it. And so what she says is that American non-resident citizens' long struggle for the right to vote was framed as a question of equality and within the discourse of expanding civil rights. And of course, the OCVRA, I haven't talked about it much yet, but it is coming at the heels of the Voting Rights Act and the amendment that lowers the voting age. I can't remember which number that is. And so for her, she says that non-resident citizens, all they had to do was kind of successfully frame themselves as another minority group seeking equal rights. And so why this is significant, why I'm telling you about it, is because Klikowski von Koppenfels doesn't think, doesn't think that American external voting has anything to do with national membership or belonging, right? She goes so far as to say that external voting makes non-resident citizens members of the American state, but they're still excluded from the American nation. And so I'm just telling you this because I don't really think it's true. And so I want you to know where my argument fits in the literature, the very sparse literature. Apart from the fact that national and state membership, I don't think can be so easily separated in the American context. But I also think that we see in the OCVRA debates that ideas about virtuous citizenship and deserving membership play a large part in justifying external voting rights. And we can see that by going back to the debates to look at the fourth kind of argument, which is how lawmakers discussed non-resident citizens' identities, right? Who even were these people abroad? But before I tell you about that, now I have to subject you to some theory that explains my approach here. And this is a really condensed version of the theory, so I'm going to leave some stuff out, but any longer would, don't want to do that. So non-resident citizens in general are very poorly legible to the state, right? Most countries, including the United States, have really, really bad information about who's actually abroad, even basic things like how many people are abroad, right? Most governments just don't really know. And that really stands out compared to the situation domestically, where citizens are really, really intimately known by the state in a lot of different ways. But even though non-resident citizens are so poorly legible to the state, policies still gets made for them, and state officials still want to kind of hold them close. And so they need some kind of idea about who's out there, what kind of ideas about membership are likely to resonate with them and get them to engage with the home country. And so what I think, and I'm really condensing a lot here, and I'm drawing on work by other people like the historian Nancy Green or the political geographer Mike Collier, who's at the University of Sussex. What I think is that these policies get made based on impressions or stereotypes that officials hold about who non-resident citizens are. Just like any impression or stereotype, they can be more, they can be less accurate, but I think that they're always a kind of prototype or a kind of template that officials use to apprehend or to bring into focus these people abroad who are otherwise really different to see, really difficult to see, I should say. And so just to put that a little more tangibly, what I'm trying to suggest is that external voting policies, you might say like other policies, I don't know, they're not necessarily made with real life living and breathing non-resident citizens in mind, because the state just can't really see those people very well. And so instead they're made for kind of imagined or constructed non-resident citizens because it's easier for the state to see those people. And those may correspond, to a few real life individuals, but they're normally a kind of, I don't know, bricolage or something of lots of different sources. And so what this means for me, practically, is that if you want to know about the ideas of membership that go into external voting policies, which is what I want to know, then you've got to find a way to identify those templates or those lenses that officials are using to see and make policy for non-resident citizens. And so an obvious and fruitful place to look for the United States case is in the records surrounding the adoption of external voting, the OCVRA debates. So how did lawmakers understand non-resident citizens' identities in the OCVRA debates? So when you look at that, you find, or I found anyway, that lawmakers constructed a fairly well-defined prototypical non-resident citizen. So who they think is abroad is a professional of some kind who's been sent abroad by his employer, who's really reluctant to go. He doesn't want to be there, and he's like coming back as soon as he can. And I say his intentionally because normally it was a man, though sometimes a few Congress people sort of wondered who might these men's wives be. So this person, right, he's abroad just for business only. His roots are shallow, and he's going to be coming back really soon. And I think that that's the person that Congress people, not all of them, but enough of them, have in mind when they're making the external voting policy. And I don't mean to suggest that there aren't people, that there weren't people like this reluctant professional abroad. Like, of course there were, and there still are, some people who fit that description. But what I am trying to suggest is that, legislating for non-resident citizens as a kind of bigger group and making this external voting policy that's going to benefit all of them, there are a lot of people abroad who this template just doesn't fit, right? So to take just a couple of examples, although we could probably go on for a long time, people who live abroad because of their family, because they've got dual citizenship, because they like it better, or because maybe they get, they wanted to work there and they get really well paid and they like it, they're not really included. And so lawmakers knew, of course, they're not stupid, they knew that there were other kinds of people abroad, but they didn't intend those people to benefit from the policy. And you see in the debates this kind of really interesting discourse around retirees. Retirees kind of bothered quite a few legislators. And they were bothered about two kinds in particular. The first was, native-born American citizens who retired to Costa Rica specifically for tax purposes. And the second was naturalized American citizens who returned to their native countries behind the Iron Curtain to draw their Social Security checks. And that one really bothered people. They generally didn't want them to benefit from external voting rights, although there are a couple of exceptions where they said it wouldn't be so bad if they did vote. But they also thought that they probably just didn't need to worry about it too much because these people weren't really connected to the United States, right? Once they went back to Minsk or to Riga, they're not going to keep voting. They're not going to keep caring about the United States. You can note, though, and this comes back to what I was saying a little bit before, that even though lawmakers intended external voting to benefit this reluctant professional figure and not the other kinds of non-resident citizen, the actual legislation is written very broadly, right? All non-resident citizens get to vote. You don't have to prove why you went abroad. You don't have to say that you didn't really want to, you were forced to go, nothing like that. And I think that this disconnect between the kind of ideas of membership behind the policy and the actual breadth of the law is kind of a problem for American external voting and non-resident citizens generally. And so Amanda Pekelski von Koppenfels, again, has written quite a lot based on survey research and interviews that a lot of American non-resident citizens feel alienated from the United States, right? They don't feel valued, I guess. They identify as American, and maybe even more importantly, they are identified as American, and they want the state to recognize them, but they don't feel that the state really sees them or really values them. And I think, obviously I can't really prove this, it's just kind of a supposition, that the disconnect between who external voting was initially intended for and who it actually benefited, that might be somewhere to look if you want to explain that alienation as well as the specific policies that they complain about. And so lawmakers didn't just describe the reluctant professional that they wanted to benefit with external voting rights. And they also implicitly described why he should still be understood as a member of the American political community. And in doing this, what they did was they emphasized his service to the nation in terms that I think are drawn from the experience with the military. And essentially what they do is they really make the reluctant professional sound like he's a soldier. And I think what they're doing is that they're leaning on an idea of membership as service to justify why these people abroad, why these kind of territorially atypical Americans should still be understood as members of the American political community. And I'm going to give you just two examples of this to show you what I mean, what kind of statements I'm basing this interpretation on. And the first is from Senator Charles Matthias, or Matthias, I don't know, maybe somebody knows. And he's from Maryland, and Matthias, okay. Charles Matthias, thank you. And he was from Maryland, and he's a very big external voting supporter, and he's shown here. And he testifies during the House committee hearings on the bill that, this is the type of society we've created, where we have these important national issues which take people abroad and sever them from their normal relationships at home. And we cast them adrift in a very large sense, but it's obviously in the American interest that they're over there. And then we have Representative Gilbert Good, do you know that one? Oh, okay. Well, Good, maybe, who is also from Maryland. And I realize it makes it seem like it was just a Maryland thing, but it wasn't. He thought that the bill was particularly significant to the people in metropolitan Washington and other parts of the country, where there's a great deal of travel abroad to carry out the business and the activities of the United States. And so this obviously all begs the question of what is this person doing abroad to serve the nation? What kind of interest is he serving? And normally the interests were squarely economic, right? Lawmakers suggested that these reluctant professionals were doing things like redressing the balance of payments, helping American companies get a foothold abroad. Sometimes they use that kind of language like footholds and beachheads. And I think really what they're doing is they're kind of spreading American capitalism in this kind of economic system, economic freedom, whatever you want to call it. And so I think at this point that it should be kind of obvious why I'm seeing the similarity between the reluctant professional and the service that grounds his claim to external voting and his political membership with the military. And the idea is that, just to put it kind of reductively, both the reluctant professional and the service member, I guess is singular, are sent abroad through somebody else's choice to do something that's constructed or presented as being in the national interest. And so here's where I think, and I realize, I could give you more evidence, but it's a talk, it's not the chapter, that the chronologically earlier extension of absentee voting rights for the military doesn't just provide a historical precedent for external voting, but it kind of suggests a standard of virtuous citizenship that justifies extraterritorial political membership. And that standard is service. And if you got carried away, you might think maybe it's sacrifice too, but I think that's going maybe too far, but sometimes I want to go there. And it's through this figure of the reluctant professional that lawmakers are, I think, constructing non-resident citizens, or at least what they take to be the modal non-resident citizen, as meeting that standard of virtue. Okay, so I think, just to sum up, what I'm suggesting is that American external voting at least when it starts, is about recognizing in part a particular kind of virtuous citizenship or membership, right? And it's that virtuous citizenship as service that we're most familiar with in the context of the military, that is the kind of American citizenship that's seen by officials as stretching, right? It can stretch across the borders, it can stretch across the ocean, it keeps you close wherever you go. Okay, so what does this all mean, right? And this is the last part, it's pretty quick. So you could draw a lot of implications from what I've just said. You could challenge it in lots of places, and you could ask a lot of questions about it. But what I want to do is to just conclude by taking one of those possible paths of inquiry and briefly consider what this all tells us about American identity, right? Does it even tell us anything interesting? So one possibility is that my interpretation of external voting challenges some established theories or ideas about American citizenship. And in Judith Shklar's famous piece about American citizenship, she notes that the martial idea of the citizen as soldier and the kind of corollary tying of citizenship rights to virtuous citizenship has been relevant throughout American history. It comes up from time to time. It's got some popularity. But Shklar, insists that this is not a universally shared notion of civic virtue, and indeed many Americans have always rejected the assumption that citizens had to prove their virtue in order to vote. Rights do not depend on it. And I think that external voting is maybe a place where we can actually see the continued influence of an ideal of virtuous citizenship drawn from military standards of service in American politics. And that's not to say Shklar is wrong, it's just to suggest that perhaps non-resident citizens are ambiguously located relative to the American polity, and so perhaps they have to kind of cast their membership claims in a different kind of key. And we can also use external voting to have a little think about, the fit of popular theories of American national identity, right? And so this is kind of coming back to what I said at the start of the talk about how we're used to reading American identity through immigration, but we can also look at it through emigration to see whether that tells us anything interesting about how the country understands itself. And so one of the most enduring accounts of American national identity is the civic one. And this understanding has been put forward by too many people to count here. But the idea is basically that the United States is constituted by shared values or ideals. And it's commitment to those values that makes someone an American and holds the nation together, right? And that's what Lady Liberty is doing there, because she's often taken to be a symbol of those values. And so the question, and I'm less interested here, I should say, in whether these theories are true than just kind of thinking about them as ideal types. And so the question of the spatiality of civic membership communities, where they can happen, is, I think, a very interesting one. And people often assume, and it comes up in the literature too, that emigration from a civic membership community cuts off membership because it must entail rejection of the constitutive ideals. But I just don't really think that there's any reason to assume that. I think it's all ultimately going to depend on the content of the ideals, right? Some ideals are infinitely stretchy. You can believe them no matter where you are. You don't have to be in a particular place to hold these ideals. And I think that the universalist ideals that are taken to constitute the United States on a civic membership understanding, things like democracy, justice, or liberty, don't, in theory at least, have any necessary connection to United States territory, right? You don't have to be on this territory to believe in those things. And so that there's nothing necessarily incompatible between this kind of American civic nationhood in theory and the existence of external voting and the extraterritorialization of political community. But of course, in practice, there might be, because we know that just believing in those ideals isn't enough to be American, otherwise half the world would be. So I think that external voting alone doesn't challenge a belief in American civic nationhood, but it just pushes us to think more critically about where civic nations can happen. But of course, it's influential and it's popular, but the civic understanding of nationhood is often challenged as downplaying the role that, racialized or ethnic or nativist ideas of membership play in defining American identity. And so I want to talk about those briefly here because I know it's going to be a question. But without meaning to downplay that, I just don't see much evidence in the debates that those kind of ideas are what's motivating external voting. And of course, you might claim that, well, the reluctant professional figure demographically is probably more likely to be white, and that may be the case, but I don't think that that's what's doing the work here. That's not the idea that's kind of behind the policy. And if you did want to read external voting through that kind of ethnic lens, you could start by looking at this concern about the Eastern European retirees, but again, I just don't think there's that much there. And so finally, this is the finally, I want to come to what I think is the most complicated question that external voting poses to understandings of American national identity. And here I'm going to offer more questions than answers. And so one very common understanding of American nationhood is that it's territorial. And so we say that more often than we actually say what it means. And a territorial national identity can take many forms, and it can mean many different things. And I think when we say it in the US case, what we're trying to suggest, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the United States is a community of individuals who share laws and who share a public culture. And that's territorial because it seems like it should require proximity or co-presence, right? You've all got to actually be in the same place to share those things. And I think external voting does really challenge a picture of the United States as a territorial nation, in that people are subject to the same laws and share a public culture. And that's because, I don't mean to suggest that laws don't apply extraterritorially. Sometimes they do. But when you're living abroad, you are kind of subject day to day to the laws of another country. And it is difficult, even with the internet, to participate fully in the public culture of somewhere where you don't live. And so I think that that kind of understanding of US identity, a kind of legalistic, almost antiseptic one, external voting challenges, right? Because if you can remain part of the national political community, even though you don't live there, something else is going on. And I should say briefly that there are other ways that non-resident citizens and kind of external citizenship challenge territorial ideas of American identity. And one of the major pieces of evidence for America's territorial identity is, of course, its jus soli, birthright citizenship laws. But there are elements of jus sanguinis in American citizenship law as well. If someone is born abroad to American citizens, or one American citizen, I think, citizenship can pass as long as the parent has spent a couple of years in the US. And so that doesn't make territory irrelevant, right? Because the parent has to have some link, but the child doesn't actually. And so I should just say that, what I'm suggesting isn't that external voting and external citizenship mean that territory doesn't matter, to American national identity. But what I'm saying is that external voting should try to kind of make us think more critically about the role that territory plays in that identity. And now I'm just this is like the final. So that's something that I have been trying to do in bits of my dissertation and elsewhere, and it's actually really, really hard. And we normally think of territory as containing political community, right? It's establishing the community's outer limits. But external voting and diaspora practices in general show that territory isn't a container of political community, because now that community is kind of stretching across in between different state territories. But on the other hand, even though people will say that this kind of heralds a deterritorialization of politics, territory clearly isn't irrelevant either, because we're still distinguishing between voters based on where they live, and we wouldn't even need this whole concept of external voting or external citizenship if territory didn't matter, because then it wouldn't matter where you were. So I've been trying to think more theoretically about non-resident citizens' relation to the territory they leave, right? Is territory relevant to that political connection, and how? And one possibility is that maybe territory anchors those connections. It kind of serves as a grounding reference point. But that's actually a really difficult question, and I'm less and less convinced lately that there's any payoff to pursuing it. But that's the end, and I hope that there was payoff in pursuing this. And thank you so much.
Is there a student question to start us off? Does anybody have? Go ahead.
I have one.
Yeah.
So I'm very unfamiliar with how external voting works in some situations. So for the example of a child that was born to the parents that have lived in the United States, where would their vote go in, say, like the Electoral College? Would they be able to affect like swing states more so than other states?
Yeah, that's a good question. It goes to the state that their parents last lived in.
All right, thank you.
Am I taking the question or do you
Oh,
want? It'd be easier if you do it.
go
So,
ahead.
Are you sure?
Yep, you got it.
Okay, yeah.
Um,
Would you mind saying your name? Because I don't know everyone.
I'm Chase.
Chase,
Yeah.
okay, nice to meet you.
You said that no politicians had reached out to external voters before. If they did, do you think more external citizens would feel more included in the American political system?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. I should clarify there. I don't mean that no politician has ever done it. I just mean that they don't kind of systematically do it. They don't see non-resident citizens as a voting bloc the way they see suburban men over 65 or, things like that. And I think that, and some politicians do it and more than others, and people do it on their behalf more often, like a proxy will do it. And I think that it probably would I don't know, it's just supposition, but I suspect that it probably would make people feel more included because one thing is that there's sometimes a temptation to analyze things like external voting as though it's totally different from the rest of the electoral process. But if it's true that outreach by candidates to other sections of the electorate, right, like when you see Joe Biden sending Kamala Harris into more Black neighborhoods, if that helps those people feel more included and more interested in voting, then I suspect it would be a similar dynamic with non-resident citizens as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So has like the I'm sorry, I'm bad. So has the like possibility of representation without taxation, like that external voter could vote for higher taxes that wouldn't affect them? Has that been like a debate at all?
Yeah, so this is another thing that I should say. So the United States, if you're a US citizen, you have an obligation to file tax returns when you live abroad. And sometimes you'll be liable to tax and sometimes you won't. It just kind of depends on a lot of things. But you do actually have to file a form with the IRS every year. And that's a really unusual policy. The only other country that makes or tries to make citizens pay tax when they live abroad is Eritrea. So state tax, I don't think you have to pay. No, you don't have to pay, but federal tax, you at least have to file the tax returns. And I should say that sometimes people will say on this question of tax, because it's really important to the American story, they'll say, well, of course America has a more extensive external voting policy. It's the only country apart from Eritrea where you're still subject to tax obligations. But I don't think that that's particularly persuasive because once you look at external voting politics in other countries, no matter whether they have to pay tax or not, there's always some story for why non-citizens economically contribute. They'll say, well, of course they don't pay tax, but they send money back, or they buy holiday homes, or they contribute to the economy in other ways. So the specifics of how they'll be sort of presented as contributing to the economy differ between cases, but that kind of core idea that they are members because they're contributing is always there. Yeah.
I was just wondering, with recent talks about changing American voting systems to utilize popular vote or ranked choice voting, how could those changes sort of alter how the American identity is impacted by external voting?
Well, I think that it's a good question, and I'd have to think about it more deeply. But I think that one thing I might say off the top of my head is it could possibly erode the territorial link between people abroad and the country even more because, if you are voting in the state of your last residence or the state of your parents' last residence, you at least have to have some connection that if you're seen by the state instead as just a person who's abroad, you don't necessarily have that kind of intermediary territorial connection. But it's definitely a good question. I don't know whether it would change anything. It may, I don't know. I have to think about it more. Thanks. Okay, maybe now I want Justin. Yeah.
So I'm Ferris. I love the talk. It was really very informative. I learned a lot. I have a question about overseas territories.
Oh yeah.
I just have a set of questions about because I kind of vaguely remember some things that have to do with like Guam, for example, and I want to see
Yeah.
how it sort of affects your theory. So my first question is, can non-resident citizens vote in these territories? Because I kind of remember that maybe they can't, because I know that the citizens who are residents of Guam, say, cannot vote, but could a Washingtonian or a Missourian vote in Guam? And then what do non-enfranchised citizens of these territories do, just for your theory? And also, if they become soldiers, so if they enlist, do they get enfranchised? Because I know, for example, again, that Guam residents tend to enlist at a higher rate than the rest of the country.
Yeah, so the question of the overseas territories is really interesting, and it kind of interacts with this stuff. So I think, and I'd have to double check, but I think that if you're a US citizen, I think that you can't, that residents of, like, if you move to Puerto Rico, I think you could vote in Washington or wherever you're registered. I think, I'll have to double check. But I think I've read that that's a kind of weird asymmetry. And I think it might even be, you know, if you're Puerto Rican from Puerto Rico and you move to, I don't know, Texas, I think when you go back, you might still be able to vote in Texas, but I'd have to check that. I don't want to do misinformation. And then with the military, yeah, I think I assume it would be the same once you join the military. You're a US citizen, you don't make a distinction between, as long as you have citizenship, I don't think they make a distinction. But it could be wrong. I don't know where you vote though. I actually have no idea about that one. I did have an idea about Puerto Rico, but now, or the territories, but now I don't have any idea about the military. So I shouldn't just imagine what the answer is. And this, what was the second question? There was an intermediate question.
What do non-enfranchised citizens do?
Oh.
Oh, just, what does that do
Yeah.
to your theory?
I don't know. And that's because it's a different kind of issue because of the disenfranchisement question, because they're US citizens on US territory, but they haven't got representation. That's a different question than being a US citizen not on territory, but you do have representation. And so I know there's a grad student at Duke who's doing some work on that, on the territories, and we've kind of talked a little bit about how they might come together, but haven't really figured it out yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, in countries where they perhaps make more of an effort to make foreigners and Americans more included and perhaps provide them with more of a path for citizenship and stuff, do you see less of an uptake in external voting because they perhaps feel like they're less American because they feel included within that community?
So that's a really interesting question, and there's quite a big body of literature on that topic, and not specifically with external voting, but with kind of immigrant integration in general. And I think the conclusion is that it's really not zero sum, and sometimes having a kind of, you know, sometimes we talk about as like a hometown network in the place where you move, having people, so for example, like having Irish people when you move to New York and you can stay Irish in some ways kind of paradoxically, I think if they can find that actually helps you become American too, because it gives you a kind of security from which you can develop other parts of yourself. And I think that, you know, until, I don't know, the 1950s or something, things like dual citizenship were just completely aberrant. Like that just didn't happen. And things like external voting would have been unthought of. And unthought of, I don't know. But now I've spoken for so long, this is not making sense in my head. Things like that would have been just unthinkable, that's the word. And I think that as that's changed over the decades, like a lot of the worst case scenarios just haven't come true because I don't think that people's identities are zero sum. I think that they can, you know, identify in multiple ways at multiple times, and it just really depends on the situation and the person and so many contextual factors. Yeah, we'll go kind of the back, I guess. Yeah, with the black mask.
And so to just go off the identity question, so it looks to me like based on what you've said, you know, Americans abroad feel more included in the American system because of their ability to vote, and obviously state governments have included them a lot more over, the past 100 years.
Yeah.
And so, but what if we switch the barrel of that gun? Do you think that people here at home view Americans abroad as less American than they are? And my reason for that is because like when you typically ask that question, that tends to connotate race or something. But looking at it from a sheerly geographic scale, you see some parts of the country think themselves more American than others, not based on race or class, but just based on where they live. Do you think that extends to Americans abroad?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say I have a huge amount of evidence for it, but I think that it might. I mean, we could do a poll and find out, right, of the room. What do you think? I really don't know. I suspect that they might, because you live somewhere else, you're subject to some another country's laws and another country's culture, and maybe speak a little strangely. But then the U.S. often, the U.S. I think, without meaning, I don't want to deny the racial aspects or the ethnic aspects or gendered aspects, but the U.S. compared to other countries does sometimes have a very inclusive way of understanding citizenship. Like as distinct to nationhood, where a US passport is like a symbol of membership in a way that it isn't for other countries. At least that's, and I don't mean that to sort of say, oh, everybody's included or something. I just mean that symbol, the citizenship, I think means more about membership than it does and not in everywhere, but in some places. And so I think that potentially there's reason to think that it would go one way and reason to think it would go another. And I don't know, you'd have to do more research on that than I have done or that I've seen. And I should say there's not a lot of my answers are just like, oh, I don't know, but there isn't a lot of research on this. And I think partly that's because the immigration paradigm of American identity is so strong that there's so much to learn about there, and you often don't, people don't often consider the flip side. Yeah, we'll go blue mask. I don't mean to call you wear masks, but.
My name's Cole. I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
And my question is about how in this calendar year, we've seen a lot of states in the aftermath of the 2020 election implement more restrictive voting laws with regard to mail-in and absentee voting. Do those changes impact external voting at all, or are those just with regard to people who are voting like in the United States?
I don't think, someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that they're really considering votes from abroad in that. And one thing with this association with the military is that when you often see things about politicians wanting to make sure all the overseas ballots are cast because it's very unpopular to not count the military's votes. And that kind of lumps in all those other people who aren't members of the military, but their votes, at least often in like the discourse or the political perception, get treated as like sacrosanct military votes that have to get counted. So the politics, I think, of restricting the absentee overseas votes are different because of the association with the military than it would be at home. Yeah.
We have some online, we have some questions from the internet too.
Oh yeah.
You want them?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Shout one out.
No, you can see them on the screen.
Oh, cool. Well, do I have to?
Oh, I thought we could.
I think we might be able to. Should I press Firefox? No, Chrome?
Yep, there
Oh,
we go.
cool. Oh, I can read them.
There you go. Yeah, there you go, Travis.
The idea that voters don't really impact elections is fascinating. I guess you can all read it too. I don't need to read it to you. Yeah, so this is a complicated question and it gets into a lot of things, and I'll try to keep it brief. The first is that turnout of external voting is really, really hard to measure because we don't have an accurate denominator. Because if you don't know how many people are abroad, really, you don't really know how many people could have voted. And you could say, well, let's just look at how many people are registered to vote. Let's make that the denominator. But states sometimes are very strategic in who they let register to vote from abroad. And so I think, for example, I think Mexican elections have had a very high turnout for non-resident citizens, at least in certain times, but it's really, really hard to register. So looking at that very small denominator makes it look good, but it's actually not. So just this thing about, are there instances where it isn't true? It's just hard to know because we don't even know how many people are abroad from those things. But there are instances certainly where it isn't true. I think Italy, there are some examples of the elections where non-resident citizens sort of swung it. I can't remember which one in the 2000s, I think. And there are also some interesting examples of country or officials giving external voting rights, thinking that non-resident citizens will do one thing and then they do the exact opposite. So in France, in 2008, they created this system of special legislative constituencies for non-resident citizens. You know, like the US and Canada are one constituency, and you can elect your representative to the Assemblée Nationale. And Sarkozy was president then, and the idea was that these people, well, they're for the right, they're going to vote for Sarkozy and the UMP, and they just didn't, right? They voted much more for the left parties than so that kind of backfired. And I don't know whether, I don't know whether it will remain true for the long run. I think that one of the big things that would change it is probably awareness that it's an option. A lot of people don't realize that they have such an expansive right to vote from abroad. And also, non-resident citizens, at least American non-resident citizens from some of the more empirical research, often say they would vote more if they could vote on the internet, because the ballots are kind of a pain. If you don't get your ballot in time, you can't send it back in time. And there is a special ballot that you can get, like just a blank one if you don't think you're going to get it in time, but that's also kind of a pain to get, and not many people know about that. So all of these kind of policy choices really feed into the turnout, and if that got made more liberal, more open, then I think that you could start to see non-resident citizens having a bigger impact. Should I do another one?
The next one's kind of related. Sorry, yeah. There we go.
Oh, yeah, I'm gonna look at that instead. Oh, I can see me, that's distracting.
I can read it.
Yeah, that would be better.
Does the presence of the Electoral College have any effect on the impact that Americans abroad have on presidential elections, positive or negative? And I guess you have to answer that, then the next one's kind of dependent on that.
I think it does have an effect. And if you remember, because it does have an effect, because often with the Electoral College, what we see is that it'll come down to like one or two states at the end, and those states are often, tight. And then every vote starts to take on outsized importance. And because the absentee ballots tend to arrive last, they tend to be seen as the ones that are going to make a difference. And we saw this in the last election with Georgia. I remember it took like forever for Georgia to get called. And Nate Silver and Nate Cohn and people like that were tweeting, oh, well, once the military and absentee ballots comes in, that's what could tip it for the Republicans, I think they thought. And we saw it in 2000 as well, where people say, I don't know how true it is, but they say that it was absentee ballots from Florida, predominantly Republicans in Israel, which is why I used that example earlier, that helped push Florida to the extent that Florida ever went over the edge. It was those ballots that helped. So just because of how the count happens and because they're the last to arrive often, it does make it seem like they're more important than maybe they are.
And then Jacob asked whether this perception of importance has made it more like there've been more efforts to keep track of this. And I had this question too, is like, are they trying to keep track of it? It seems like there's a lot of scanning and barcoding that goes on when you go in and out of the countries.
Yeah, there is a lot of scanning and barcoding, but no one, a lot of people who are non-resident citizens don't really come in and out that often. And also, I don't know what they do with that scanning and barcoding. I don't know if it gets sent to anywhere that would actually keep track of it on a kind of more granular level. I think that, there might be more of an impact. I think that that's actually a good point, and that there might be more of an effort if they did make more of an impact, because you might see politicians actually thinking, well, hang on, we need to know who these people are. And I think there used to be better statistics. And I think the last like really good statistics maybe were gathered in like 1950 or something. So that could be something that would increase interest. But you know, there's between, I think people often say between like 2.5 and 9 million civilian non-resident citizens. And so that's, you know, that's a fairly substantial, medium-sized state, I think.
That's a big range.
Do we know how large the vote is, the broad vote has been?
Oh, how much it's
Like
been?
how the numbers has been?
I can look it up. I looked it up and then I forgot. I think it's between like 10 and 20%. Like it's low.
Low turnout.
Yeah, low turnout. Low turnout. And then they have these surveys where people say, well, I would have voted if I could have got the ballot, or if only I'd known, or you know, people always say that. I would have done it, except for I didn't.
There's one more. I think that's all of Jacob. There's one more.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, how important is the paying taxes?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of the answer I gave earlier. Yeah. I can answer it.
What's the relationship? So I thought what Shannon was asking, which is a
Oh,
question I
I
had too, was
see.
like, is there any relationship between the Eritrean
Yeah.
tax policy and the
I see.
particular-
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But first of all, most countries have external voting, and most countries, only 2 countries have this kind of tax obligation. So that would suggest that there isn't really a relationship. And I don't know what Eritrea's election status is.
Was it done in the same? Well, it's not part of the same legislation.
Oh, no. Sorry. No, it's not part of the same
I'm
legislation.
just imagining what.
Yeah.
what
No,
Shannon's-
not part of the same
And
legislation.
Shannon, if you're there, you can just pop, you know, if I didn't ask your question right, you
I
just
don't think it's
get right in there.
I don't
Okay,
know.
well, that's all we got online.
Okay,
I think there's other people here.
yeah, we'll go here and then back to Jay. Yeah.
I'm also a Shannon.
Oh, great.
So I know that your talk was like more empirical, but I was
Yeah.
kind of like had like a theory-based
Yeah.
question. So like, I was wondering if maybe like, it seems like you're talking about how like, if you have traced a change in like identity formation over time, like since you track it over this kind of like 50-year
Mhm.
period, if it is more like based on how you like where you come from like locally, how you're going to be like voting, or if you have like how you see yourself like attached to like a nation or like a place.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And that's something that I think about often. I don't have a neat answer, but I'll tell you what I think about it. Because I think that that's, to me, getting at the kind of scale of political identity. Is it local? Is it regional? Is it national? Is it supranational? And often, I think there's one question. There's a question of how do people subjectively what are people subjectively identifying with when they go to cast their ballot? And there is actually some research that shows that, or suggests anyway, that kind of casting this ballot is sometimes like a sort of effective experience, it's like a nation building kind of thing. And I think many people would say, well, I vote from abroad and I'm not thinking about my country, I'm thinking about my town, or I'm thinking about my family, or I'm thinking about, you know, the regional power blocks in South America or something. And I think that that's a fair point, but national identity, national membership is very complicated, and I think it gains its power because it draws on identifications at other scales, right? The town, the home gets conflated with the nation, the regions get conflated with the nation, and there's 2 examples that I think show this well. One is, I'm not gonna talk about one. So one, we can talk about it later, but I don't want to talk about it now. So one, you know, one of the famous examples of national identity, people will say, well, look at all the soldiers that go out and die for their nation. And then people will say in response, well, actually, you know, I mean, I'm not a soldier, I don't know, maybe someone wants to tell me who is, but they'll say, well, actually, you know, I wasn't thinking of my nation, I was thinking of, you know, my buddy next to me, or I was thinking of my family at home. But those kind of lower scale identifications often get conflated with, they feed into some more abstract idea of the nation. And that's kind of where they get their power. So I didn't totally answer your question.
No, it's a really good answer. Like,
Okay.
I'm satisfied.
Okay. And Jay, I think you had a question?
Yeah, Jay, you want to take the last one?
Sure. It's just fantastic. So many things to say here. I guess I'll have 2 questions for you. The first was about the construction of the professional man.
Yeah.
in its significance to the passage of the Overseas Voting Rights Act in the mid-70s. I mean, I'm sure you're totally right. I would just add to it, isn't it the case that it's that moment in time in which that legislation moves through the system is really opportune, and the Dutch gal's right in the sense that it's opportune. It's coming at the tail end of the rights revolution.
Yeah.
But it's also coming at the end of this really peculiar moment in American history in which you have exceedingly low immigration rates. And the thing about the immigration is you have the return migration and you have the visits overseas. That's when you need the overseas voting. So I believe that the all-time low of the percentage of the US population overseas is 1975, and it's like 4.3% or something. And I could only imagine, what I'm trying to spit out is I could only imagine this legislation passing at that particular moment. Of course, also coinciding with the projection of power overseas with the Cold War and the idea that business is part of the projection of that power. So I totally agree with your point. I just say that race and ethnicity really matters, but that's absent at that moment. I mean, you got some of those Eastern European Jewish migrants, but you don't have the Hart-Celler change in terms of the Latino and Asian and African migration. So in the grand scheme of the demography of US, it's a really, really particular moment at the tail end of the 1924 era. That's my first point, which just, I guess, just reinforces what you're saying. Anything else? The second point is about the construction of or the voting abroad. Anecdotally, in my 20 some odd years, it got both easier and harder. It got harder in the sense of, I suspect, not new roadblocks, but the more aggressive regulation and monitoring of the voting process from abroad, like the dates when you had to get the absentee ballot, the actual process, the documentation you had to submit. It got really, really complicated. At the time, I always wrote it off to the fact that I suspected the clerk knew who I was voting for in that swing seat for the Kansas Board of State Education, the most important vote I ever made. And she knew I was voting for and didn't want that person on the school board. But looking back at it through, of course, the prism of what's happened since, one suspects maybe there's a broader story. So it got much harder. It got so much easier, and it wasn't because of state activity, but it got easier because the organization of expatriate voters through the Democratic Party. Now, the Republican Party is a different story, but the Democrats do understand that there's a constituency there. They do understand it's predominantly Democratic. And they have a partisan organization that mobilizes support, sends out the emails, tells you when you need to submit your voter registration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Republicans don't really have a parallel structure. And as you saw in that Super Tuesday thing, of course we would have hosted the Republican thing. There wasn't one. To be bipartisan, we invited the gal who launched a Republican super PAC. And the idea was it would organize Republican expat voters. My understanding is that thing never got off the ground. Nothing ever happened to it. So I guess I wonder, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. What I'm trying to say is that to your theory of nationalism, and how these expats fit in, I mean, isn't it that the formulation of a shared identity of being an expat voter, mediated not through general civic nationalism or through the territory, but through new institutions and civic organizations. In this case, obviously a partisan organization, but there's things like American clubs, American golfers abroad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which are creating that same kind of phenomenon. So they're thinking of themselves as something different, actually, even if they're connected. And what made me think of that is your point about the scale of national identity from the family to the township and the state and so forth. The next pat is just another one of those.
Jay, we need your question to end with a question.
No, I I'll just answer really quickly because I think those are really good points. And on the first one, I think you're totally right. And honestly, it's funny because people who study immigration always say, oh, immigration is just the flip side of immigration. But I think what I haven't done is realize that immigration is the flip side of immigration. And so I think that paying more attention to that context is like definitely the right place to look. And the second point, yeah, that's also a really good point. And part of a big story of American external voting is non-resident citizen organization, like those women in the picture in the tea bags. And I think that is a big part of the story, and that it could be its own identity. And I do wonder though, like Oxford and Southern England in particular is obviously like one of the hotbeds for Americans abroad. And I wonder, how that is different in different places where there aren't so many Americans and aren't so many kind of short-term people who are unlikely to have. Because I think this is really weird. I think that there's a difference between, and it's something that's hard to get at. There's a difference between people who are, and I don't know what your personal situation is, like your family, but I think that there's a difference between people who are Americans with an American family living abroad and people who are maybe dual citizens and are more integrated into that society. And so I think that would be interesting to look at too, to see how that expat identity resonates differently depending on your integration. But thank you. I really liked, that was great.
All right, Tara, thank you for that.
Thank
Excellent
you.
thought. Hang out and continue the conversation.
Oh, we